Hegemonic stability theory. The current array of international institutions were built by the largest power in the system in order to sustain the prevailing economic system and international political order, and are mainly designed to ensure there's no recurrence of a trade collapse similar to the 1930s depression that resulted in a large war. These international institutions are in turn created and sustained by a hegemonic power that has just won a systemic war. A systemic war is a conflict involving most or all of the international system's great powers, where a great power is a state with at least 10% of the total power of the international system. The hegemonic power is the most powerful state in the system, and the leading state that has just won the last systemic war. The hegemonic power usually has the largest and most innovative trading economy and the largest navy, and it imposes its domestic norms onto the world through institutions that it designed. Kalevi-Holsti created this chart to illustrate the major settlements. The Treaty of Westphalia of 1648 established the modern state system and followed the 30 Years' War. The Treaty of Utrecht of 1713 followed the War of the Spanish Succession, in which Louis XIV attempted to conquer Central Europe. The Conference at Vienna of 1815 settled the New World Order after the defeat of Napoleon. The Paris Conference, after the end of the First World War, in 1918, established the new order, including the creation of the League of Nations. The signatories at San Francisco created the United Nations and set the world order after the Second World War. Now, Holsti made a distinction between different variables for each of these treaties to show that the treaties actually vary in their functionality. But the key issues are the variable of governance, which is at the top. Governance indicates that the treaties created a structure that allowed for the continued consultation of the victors at the end of the war, and also created a new set of institutions that allowed for those powers to interact in a new political and commercial order. For example, the conference at Vienna after the defeat of Napoleon led to the Concert of Europe, and the conference at Paris created the League of Nations, and the signatories in San Francisco created the United Nations. So there were all attempts at creating mechanisms of governance for the states to interact. Some of these arrangements also have conflict resolution mechanisms. The United Nations has that today. It has a court that allows member disputants to present their cases for third-party resolution. Some of these treaties also foresaw peaceful change. In other words, they were adapted to allowing new members or to change the status of the members. Some of these treaties had unintended consequences. For example, the Treaty of Westphalia had a deterrent mechanism. But originally it was a collective security mechanism. France, which was generally not a very strong state, was given the power, along with other states, to organize against any new emerging threats to the system. Specifically, the French were allowed to intervene into the Rhineland, into the Palatinate. When Louis XIV came to power, almost a century later, Louis XIV took that collective security mechanism and used it as a justification for his invasion of Central Europe. So very often, the mechanisms that allow for collective security in one period that are meant for weak states to redress their position, if those states become great powers, they can then use those as an excuse to spread their conflict. You can see on the top right the front pages of some of the documents in the Treaty of Utrecht. So we have our first theory, and this comes from AFK Organsky's power transition theory. This is the principal hegemonic stability theory of war. So it unites hegemonic stability theory and the phenomenon of war. Organsky conducted statistical tests and found that wars between the most powerful states of any period occur as the two states pass or are about to pass each other in total power. In other words, war happens when one of the states is in relative decline. In every power transition, there's a status quo state, which is the established power which is in relative decline and which has an interest in preserving the current international order. There's also a challenger or revisionist state, which seeks to overturn the international system and defeat the status quo power. The challenger state is normally rising rapidly in power in comparison with the status quo states and wants therefore to take over the international system. Now in 1980, this study was updated and it was found that war starts when a challenger is stronger than the hegemon, but it tends to lose because it has a weaker coalition. So Germany grew very quickly and surpassed the English economy at the beginning of the 20th century. But Germany ultimately lost because it couldn't create a coalition to resist the British. Now, a satisfied challenger state will inherit and not overturn the international system. After World War II, the English were too weak to be a global hegemon. They basically couldn't continue to dominate the system after 2 world wars against Germany. The Americans were a challenger state. They wanted to replace England. But there was no war. The Americans inherited the system from the English, because in general the US was satisfied with the commercial structure that the British had set up. So here you would see the type of coalition structure between the dominant and the dissatisfied states, or the status quo power, the satisfied powers, and their challenger or revisionist states. So the dominant state's on top. Most of the great powers and many of the middle powers and some of the small powers are associated with the dominant state. The dissatisfied states are led by a great power, and some of the middle powers and the smaller powers. So here you can see the red power, which is growing, but the orange state is growing more quickly. And so there's different opportunities for war. Either at the red arrow, the status quo state can attack the challenger, or once the challenger has surpassed the status quo state, it can violently reorder the international system. Here are some ongoing and historical power transitions. We can see the power of the Ottoman Empire in the 16th century, and how they went into a steep decline and then effectively disintegrated. We can see the rise of China at the extreme right. We can see France, which is a middle power, then became a great power in the 1720s under Louis XIV, but then fell behind England. We can see the Netherlands, and the rise of Sweden, and the rise of Russia and the Soviet Union, and of Prussia and Germany, and of Japan, and all the opportunities there are for these transitions leading to war. So the second theory is long cycle theory and hegemonic wars. There are a set of theories grouped under the title of long cycle theories that seeks to explain the periodic dominance of the international system by the single most powerful state, which is termed a hegemon, and the transition of power from one hegemonic power to the next typically occurs through or during a general or world war. The precise timing of these hegemonic states is in perpetual scholarly dispute, but there's a general consensus on the broad outlines of the succession and its nature. The hegemonic cycle started with the rise of Europe in world affairs around AD 1500. The statistical evidence is that hegemonic wars follow the pattern of probing, adjusting, and then you have a hegemonic war. And you have 100-year cycles between 1494 and 1973. For hegemonic states, they invariably had preeminent naval power that was grounded in commercial and technological dominance. For example, today the US Navy is the largest in the world and probably strong enough to defeat every other navy. As long as these states are dominant, they shape the structure of the international system, particularly commerce. typically pursuing free trade. But this free trade is predatorial. When the Dutch were free trading with England, they would dump goods on the English market, but then their navy would interfere with British merchants that tried to export British goods to other ports. But as these hegemons become overextended in defending their interests, where they divert money to build navies and not engage in commerce, they fall behind technologically to other states that are investing more in their economy. And ultimately, they fall behind commercially to a rising challenger. For example, the UK in the mid-1850s accounted for 58% of the world's economy. The British were an industrial powerhouse. They manufactured in England more than the rest of the world combined. But by 2006, the British had declined to only 2% of the world's economy. The British spent too much money on a large navy and not enough on research and development and reinvestment in new technologies. When Germany rose, they focused not on the iron industry like the English, but on steel and chemistry, and surpassed the English economically and industrially with these new technologies. Because the dominant state obtains resource benefits by controlling the international system, they rarely make room for challengers. So the US has a very little interest in giving up its domination of the international financial institutions like the IMF or the World Bank, or institutions of dialogue like the United Nations. If the US were to release what influence it has in those institutions, particularly the financial ones, the American dollar would become more vulnerable to the policies of other countries. And this would disadvantage the US. For a hegemon, trade and financial power in the form of banks matters more for maintaining naval dominance than natural resources, such as, say, wood. You can always buy natural resources. The British Navy got its wood from the Baltic, what is today Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and Finland, and from New Brunswick, and from parts of Asia. There's no large trees in England sufficient to build its large navy. So the British power was not based on natural resources, it was based on commerce and the ability to buy the resources they need. Now, if the challenger is a naval power, it defeats and takes over the empire of the preceding status quo naval power and becomes the new status quo naval power. We saw this with the Dutch, who supplanted both the Portuguese and the Spanish with their global naval power. Now, what do I mean by naval power? Well, most states in those days had very poor roads, and unless you were China, you didn't have a very large canal system, so almost every country in the world had coastal shipping. But if a state wanted to trade with its neighbor that was not simply up or down its coast, it would have to go into the open oceans. And there, the Portuguese controlled many of the global choke points. They could stop countries from going through the choke points, like, for example, Cape Town in South Africa. So the Dutch were able to shape trade and stop trade where they didn't want it to happen. And ultimately the Dutch replaced the Spanish and the Portuguese as maritime hegemons. Now, Modelsky and Thompson have done a lot of research on naval power, particularly as it applies to hegemonic stability. For them, the challenger, if it's a land power, is defeated. But it so weakens the hegemonic state that another maritime power then inherits the position. So we think of the Anglo-Dutch defeat of France. This weakened Holland enough that the British then became the hegemon. The British defeat of Germany weakened England enough that the US then replaced the English by the middle of the 20th century. Now, there's been significant disagreement on the actual general wars that were hegemonic wars. But the periods roughly coincide in the following waves. So 1494 to 1585, you got the Portuguese and the Spanish, and we think of Spain as a naval power, but it wasn't. The Spanish actually didn't have a royal fleet. They had a few ships that carried bullion, gold and silver from South America, the mines of Potosi, and you had ships that traded with China and came from Manila, but the Portuguese actually had a state fleet. In 1475, the Portuguese wiped out the Spanish fleet off the coast of West Africa, and it took centuries for the Spanish to rebuild their fleet. So Spain was a terrestrial power with some naval capacity, where Portugal was a truly global naval power. These Portuguese and Spanish were challenged by the Dutch. In the War of Dutch Independence, the Dutch replaced the Spanish and the Portuguese. The Dutch were then the hegemon for about a century, and then the English challenged them during the wars of Louis XIV, and England replaced the Dutch. The English then had a standoff against the French. The French were ultimately defeated. The British went from mercantilism to industrialization, and so were able to survive for another century, and then they had to confront Germany and Japan in the First and Second World Wars, and then England was weakened economically. And then the US rose up. And then because of nuclear weapons, we had a Cold War. And ultimately the Soviet Union collapsed. And so what are we looking at now for the next challenger? Probably China. But why not India? And this is the map of Pax Britannica. Basically the 19th century, when the British dominated about 20% of the world's area and about 25% of the world's population, all tied together through the British fleet. And what's important there are the black lines, which are trade routes, but also are the principal routes for the underwater telegraph lines, which enabled the British to have instant communications across the globe to their various stations. This is a chart showing relative economic power between 1750 and 2000. And it shows France and Britain in general decline, and it shows the rapid rise of the USSR. But subsequently, estimates of Soviet industrialization have been both distorted and exaggerated. When the Cold War ended, virtually all economists halved the size of the Soviet economy. So the Soviet economy was artificially inflated by the perception that it was strong militarily. So you have to be very careful when you examine these kinds of statistics. So victory by a new hegemon brings a restructuring of the international system, which typically includes a new set of international institutions and structure of trade. So the UN is a product of US victory in World War II, and if China surpasses the US, we could expect the UN to be closed down and replaced with a Chinese institution, perhaps in Shanghai. World commerce did not exist until the European navies. Specifically, the Portuguese cleared the trade routes of hostile navies in the 16th century. You did have trade, but it was much more difficult to travel across the world as a merchant sailor. When the Portuguese wiped out all the smaller fleets, it basically left commercial commerce to the control of the hegemons. Now, just because the Portuguese controlled the oceans didn't free it for everyone. The Portuguese basically allowed those countries that were friendly to it to trade on its routes. So the command of the world's oceans has since passed to the Dutch, then the British, and now the US Navy. In each period, free trade is preferentially established around the hegemonic power because it enjoys a temporary technological and commercial advantage. During Dutch hegemony, British traders condemned free trade as a Dutch conspiracy to dominate world trade. But after the English surpassed the Dutch and took over domination of the world's oceans and trade, it was the British who championed free trade, and it was the Dutch who argued that free trade was a British conspiracy to dominate the world's economy and trade. Periods of peace have been periods of preponderance by a single hegemon, and periods of war have been periods of decline of that hegemon. And you think of the examples of Pax Britannica. When the British were dominant in the late 19th century, the world was generally peaceful. There were very few wars, very few large systemic wars. But when Britain went into decline, the Germans built a fleet and the English could be challenged. The British pulled their fleet out of every ocean and concentrated the fleet in Europe just so they could deter the German fleet. And as a consequence, they lost control of the world's oceans. What would happen to the US, rather to the United Nations, the World Bank, and attempts at liberalizing world trade to the World Trade Organization if the US were to go into sharp decline? Some would argue that it would fail, since these are in essence institutions set up for America's benefit at the beginning of its period of hegemony at the end of the Second World War, and could not persist without it. Now look at the reader that I've given you. There's an article by Jack Levy, and there are other theories of these long cycle theories that lead to war. There's Arnold Toynbee, famous historian, Bill Thompson and George Medelsky, Robert Gilpin, Charles Doran, and Vereenan. And they all have variations on the long cycle theory. The 1929 stock market crash was followed by the Great Depression of the 1930s, and it was generally seen as a severe and undesirable event. Everyone became poorer, though no one wanted to. Now, the essential structure of the economic relationship in the 1920s was a U.S. economy, particularly its banking structure, dependent on loan payments from Europe, because the American banks had loaned money to the English and French governments during the First World War to help them finance the conflict to defeat Germany. Now, the English and French, in turn, obtained their funds from German war reparations, which were severely punishing. So the English and French would demand money from Germany, and the way that the Germans would respond was by devaluing their currency in order to obtain cheap enough goods that they could export. In Germany, it caused crippling hyperinflation. And it also devalued the reparations to the English and the French. So the English and the French were not able to completely repay the loans to the U.S. at the rate at which they promised. Now the Germans obtained their government funding from exports. So they would encourage their economy to export to the U.S. They would get funds from that export, and then they would pay the reparations to the English and French governments. Now, what happened with the 1929 stock market crash was it led to the Smoot-Hawley Act of June of 1930 in the U.S., in which the U.S., to protect the jobs of its workers, it decided to reduce foreign competition and focus on a domestic market, and so it threw up tariffs. But then, of course, just about every other country in Europe also threw up tariffs in laws that were very similar to the Smoot-Hawley Act. So Germany could no longer export to the U.S. At that point, the reparation payments from Germany to England and France stopped. The English and French couldn't repay the loans they borrowed to American private banks. And American private banks began to fail in very great numbers. And with the failure of the banks, there was a lack of finance for large-scale projects. And so you had a general failing of the system. There were no winners in the Great Depression. There was no relative gains. It was a negative-sum game. Everyone lost. And depression, of course, led to unemployment, which led to the rise of radical parties on the left and the right. And in Central Europe, you had the rise of fascism over communism, and this ultimately informed the foreign policies of those states. Here you can see the impact on the Depression in the top graph, showing the dramatic rise of unemployment, particularly in Germany and the US. You can see in the lower chart the drop in demand for primary products. You can see the rise of world unemployment, almost 30% of households. You can also see world commodity production and the dramatic drop in prices. That's deflationary, which is bad. Here you can see the drop in industrial production, wages and salaries, and farm cash income. And below, you can see the dramatic rise in votes for the Nazi Party, the NSDAP, in the Reichstag elections. So you can see how employment in Germany between 1928 and 1936 correlates with voting support for the Nazi Party. You can see the Nazi Party in brown in the Second Reichstag only had 32 seats. And then in the Third Reichstag they had 14 seats, and that was further depressed in the Fourth Reichstag to 12 seats. It was a very marginal party. But then, after the stock market crash, their seats jumped to 107 deputies in 1930. We can see that in 1932 they were a third of the seats. And this increased again in 1932 further in the runoff election. And then finally, they were almost half of all the deputies, 288 out of 647 in the 8th Reichstag. And the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany led to the Nazi foreign policy becoming the foreign policy of Germany that ultimately led to the Second World War. So the depression of the 1930s that was triggered by the 1929 stock market crash began as a simple recession, which is inevitable in the upswing and downswing of the business cycle. However, the recession became long and deep because of the absence of any willing hegemonic intervention to keep the recession from turning into a long, difficult depression. So this was an entirely avoidable outcome. The 1929 stock market crash was not inevitably going to create the Great Depression of the 1930s. It was allowed to happen by great powers not coordinating how they were going to provide services, public goods, to the international system. Basically, lenders and markets of last resort. Now, Kindleberger proposed an explanation for why the Second World War happened by explaining how the 1929 stock market crash turned into a depression and not a recession. Kindleberger argues that hegemons do more than simply exploit their dominant strategic position in the world to extract resources, but rather the international system is a public good that benefits all states, and it's in the interest of the hegemon to ensure that the system continues to function. What's a public good? A public good is characterized by two characteristics. Number one, non-rivalness. There's no zero-sum trade-off in access to the public good. A gain of one state over another indicates a zero-sum kind of relationship. But in non-rivalry, every state has access to the good, and one state's access does not make another state become poorer. The second characteristic is non-exclusiveness or non-excludability. No state can be excluded from the benefits of the public good. Therefore, states may benefit from, for example, trade without having to expend resources to maintain it. So if a country were to eliminate piracy, all trading countries would benefit. If a country were to reduce pollution, all states downwind would benefit. They couldn't be excluded from it. So a hegemon is expected to provide a public good, the good functioning of the international system. Some of the other functions of a hegemon would be to deploy a navy to stop piracy and to allow easy commerce. Now, Kindleberger argues that it was the failure of the British and American hegemons to manage the international system that caused the Great Depression. And this ultimately brought unemployment that put fascist regimes in power in Germany, Italy, and Japan, and was the main cause of the Second World War. Hegemons provide two crucial services to maintain the international political economy. One, the hegemon is the lender of last resort. When the economy enters into a recessionary cycle, most private and small state lenders become reluctant to provide loans. Typically, the hegemon enters and provides low-interest counter-cyclical loans to desperate businesses and other small states. And in the 1870 Great Depression, not the 1930 Depression, but in the 1870 Great Depression, this is precisely what the English did. They extended credits from banks to keep the economy going. In the short term, the English had to pay for this, but in the long term, the British benefited because the system created markets that bought British goods. The hegemon is also the market of last resort. As an economy enters a recession, states tend to become protectionist to protect domestic employment by raising tariffs to keep out foreign competition. Because all follow the identical strategy, trade flows come to a halt, actually worsening unemployment in all of the states. The hegemon keeps its tariffs low to provide counter-cyclical market for states that can't sell their goods elsewhere, and thereby maintains the integrity of the free trade system. But of course, it's politically difficult because the British workers lose their jobs. So it can only be done by a wealthy hegemon. So this is what the English did in 1870. In the 1920s and the 1930s, the British were unable to maintain the responsibility of being the hegemon because of their decline relative since the 19th century and the costs of the First World War. The US, which was the most powerful state in the international system, was, however, unwilling because of its isolationist politics of avoiding foreign entanglements in Europe. So the British were basically too poor, and the Americans were not interested in becoming the hegemon. So the US and UK each tried to free ride on the other's power, which is captured by Rousseau's stag hunt game. The United Nations was established at the end of the Second World War not to stop war directly, but to provide the institutional framework to support the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. And these were designed specifically to ensure there was never a Great Depression again that would lead to fascist governments going and starting a war through radical foreign policies. Now there are critics. Joanne Gowa has argued that there is no need to have a hegemon to maintain an international economic system. First of all, free trade is a myth. Hegemons do not pursue free trade, but instead they look for optimal tariffs, and they use force to manipulate the system to ensure these benefits. Number two, free trade is not a public good, but it can be excludable. The hegemon excludes states from trade that do not submit to its authority in the international system. North Korea has a great many limitations on who it can trade with. States like Iran have difficulty exporting oil to certain countries that have sanctions on them, like Venezuela. Number three, smaller states can actually cooperate to maintain a public good without needing a hegemon under certain circumstances. The circumstance is called the Coase theorem, C-O-A-S-E. And there's a fair bit of literature about how the small countries can overcome coordination problems. And the Coase theorem shows that you don't need a coordinator or a director to achieve these outcomes. Now we have the Cold War and the Long Peace. And the Cold War is not a general war. After the Second World War, air power replaced naval power as the key to controlling the oceans. At the end of World War II, the US had over 50% of the world's productive capability. This dropped to 17% in the 1970s. It stabilized around 20% by the mid-1980s as a result of the reforms of Ronald Reagan, basically bringing down tariffs and introducing foreign competition into the American market. Most of hegemonic stability literature comes about in the 1970s with the decline of the US and concerns of what this would have for the world order, since many of the institutions like the United Nations were dependent on US power. So this raised two major questions. One, do hegemons benefit from their exploitation of the international system, or do they become overextended and depleted by maintaining the system over time as a public good for others? And two, is the US actually in decline or not? Well, the results, you can imagine, the fear was that if the US fell into decline, it would cause the collapse of the UN, the IMF, the World Bank. Free trade would collapse, and innumerable other organizations established under US hegemony would fail, leading to a certain amount of disorder in the international system. So you could represent this as a sort of a table here. You've got the double pessimists, that the US is in decline, and hegemons are losing net when they're managing the system. So here the US is losing control, and this will result in world disorder. Commentators have been commenting constantly about the arrival of the multipolar system that's going to eclipse the US. And it hasn't happened yet. China's rising, and India's rising, but their militaries are not quite at the stage of being able to confront the US. Will multipolarity ever come? There are then the pessimists, which is that, well, the US is not in decline, but it is losing by maintaining the system. So the US will remain in control, but it will cost. Then there are the optimists, which is the US is in a decline in terms of power, but by being the hegemon, it does benefit. So the US will decline, but international cooperation will probably compensate. And then there are the double optimists, which is that, you know what, the U.S. is not in decline, and it's going to win by dominating the system. Joseph Nye challenged Kennedy's argument, the scholar Kennedy, who looked at the rise and fall of the great powers, that we looked at very briefly in the Balance of Power lecture. And Joseph Nye said, well, you know, the powers there are countries that get more powerful and less powerful, but the U.S. is special, because the U.S. has something called soft power. The U.S. has cultural knowledge and reputational power that causes other countries to emulate it. I visited the Soviet Union in the late 1980s, and I thought I would find a very well organized military political system, but what I found was people confronting me trying to buy my genes. And they told me that they watched the movie Rambo, and they all wanted to go to discos. The Soviet Union collapsed because the Russian people wanted jeans, coke, and rock and roll, which are elements of American consumerism. And that's a kind of soft power, because it's not something controlled by American leadership. But there's also the power of human rights, of democracy, and these were crucial in causing the very rapid collapse of Eastern Europe and the Warsaw Pact, Poland, East Germany, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Bulgaria. In about 12 months, they went from a strong working class supporting communism to mass demonstrations in the streets and to total collapse of communist governments.